Welcome to Semi-Sages of the Pages, the writing podcast where we're not sure where we're going, but we're having an adventure.
This podcast contains adult themes and language at times.
At times? What fun is that?
And discretion is advised.
Hi, and welcome to Semi-Sages of the Pages. I'm Morgan.
I'm Teresa.
This is Molly.
And this is Sarah.
If I could have done that more awkwardly, I didn't try to make it. I just did. Sorry.
And today we're going to be talking about balance, which apparently we need to work on in our intros, but not the kind of balance you might think. In this kind of balance, we're going to talk about the importance for authors to balance writing their dialogue with their description and how to even that out in your text. So one common issue that we see with intermediate writers before they really click over to the advanced category is that they tend to either be one or the other, either a heavy dialogue writer or a heavy description writer. And I think it's really important for every voice to find its sweet spot. And of course, that's a little bit different depending on genre and voice. But today we're going to have a discussion about how to find this sweet spot between balancing dialogue and description throughout your novel. So let's start with Pitfalls. What are some of the traps and zaps you guys find yourself in when you're writing? Are you dialogue heavy? Are you description heavy?
So I'm dialogue heavy. My first drafts are all dialogue. With sometimes I'm describe the room, ...
That's fair.
Yeah, room description to follow. And I find it's good because I hear my characters' voices, and that's kind of what I focus on, is evening all that out. But if I'm not careful, as I'm writing it in my head, I know the shape of the room, I know how the characters are moving around it and everything else. And then when I edit it later, I forget that the reader doesn't know that stuff, because at that point I've read it a bunch of times. So I've established the room, what it looks like in my head. I've established what the characters look like in my head. And then I have to remind myself, go back through and add some more descriptions. Yeah, so that's talking about pitfalls. That's probably the biggest one, is just being cognizant of what is on the page and what is in my head.
For me, the biggest Oh, sorry.
No, go Molly.
For me, the biggest pitfall that I see with people, and I do it sometimes too, but you really, really can see it, is when someone very clearly has dialogue. Then after the dialogue, there is a block of text, which is a description. And then the dialogue is back, and it's in blocks instead of woven together. And especially you have the talking, it's the characters are talking heads. You don't know what the characters are doing while they're talking, if they're showing any emotion, if they're moving, if they're I don't know what that gesture was from Teresa, flicking hair.
That was a hair flip.
Flipping.
Hair flip.
Yeah, there's so much of, when we talk as humans, there's so much that we do for communicating that is beyond speaking. It's how we move, how we interact with the people, stuff like that. And often with dialogue, especially first drafts or sometimes beginner intermediate writers, you get so-and-so, blah, 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 he said. Blah, 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 she said. Blah, 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 he said. And you don't get blah, 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 he said, pushing his hair out of his face and touching her hand. The walls to the room were, I can't speak off the cuff apparently, but weaving in the narrative as you do the description, as you do the dialogue. And that balance is different for a lot of different scenes, but that kind of weaving in, I think, is really important.
Agree.
Sarah, your turn.
I think just described was exactly one of the things I do, is doing the block. Because I was heavily influenced by Charles Dickens and Jane Austen, and all of those paid by the word types. And I think I tend to lean more heavily into the description scattered throughout dialogue. So that's something I've been working very hard on. It's not kind of going off on and the S cup in front of, well, she picked up the S cup in the middle of talking and stirred coffee that really does taste like mud if you don't add milk to it. And just going off on these tangents about the world that they're in as we're doing intermixed with dialogue. That's one of the pitfalls that I've fallen into, and I'm very much trying to narrow down. And it's actually really funny because I'm going through my older short stories right now. I see Teresa laughing because she got to edit these for me. And that was a really big thing I did, where you'd be in the middle of this somewhat intense dialogue that's really moving the scene forward. And then I'm like, and I'm going to go describe something really random that's in the room right now because I feel like this scene is missing this. So I tend to get lost in my world building, even if it's like a police station. So that's something that I am definitely now aware of and find myself working through. And it's just really funny to go back and look at your older works and see like, oh, crap, what was I doing? What was I thinking? But we just didn't know back then when we were first starting.
But
and where
flips, oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, where you put in those descriptions can be really powerful in the middle of a dialogue scene, because it can show, someone not paying attention, or someone like hyper focusing on something, or all these like there's really cool things that you can do by picking. And then what details do you pick to show?
Mm-hmm.
All of that can be really, really interesting and powerful in a good scene.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, how we live, how we set up our lives, how our desks are organized, can be character builders too. So when you're describing a room, it should be either tapping into the emotion that's going on in there. Like for example, I've got a great scene in River City where the character, let me see if I can think of it. The character leans back in the chair. She's sitting next to someone, and her love interest kind of sort of like drapes his arm kind of across the back of the couch, but not around her. And then she's kind of like, well, crap. Now I have to like
get around.
Do I move? Do I not? And then there's another character in the room, and she's like, oh, great. So she saw that happen. So now that other character's like, ooh, I wonder what's going on with these guys. So by that description, that's actions and descriptions without the dialogue, but I'm pushing the plot forward because that character is now forced to be like, so we're not together, but we're kind of sort of interested in each other, but this isn't a good time because, a ghost just threw me out of my house. So, yeah, so it's trying to intersperse all that stuff together with your description. And one thing I want to go back to, Sarah is a gorgeous description writer. Absolutely gorgeous. Like I'll sit there and I'm like, character ate a red apple. And she's like, the red apple that was glistening in the sun with dew on it. It's beautiful. And it sets a scene. Whereas I'm like, red apple, move on.
And
there's symbolism behind the apple.
And Morgan mentioned this when she was introducing the topic. There is a different balance and there's different styles.
Mm-hmm.
So there's nothing wrong with being more descriptive. There's nothing wrong with that. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with being less descriptive, depending on what genre you're writing in
mm-hmm.
and your own personal style. You can find a balance, and that balance can be uniquely yours.
What you don't want to do, though, is get stuck in something. I'm currently, I recently finished a book that was, I would say, 90% description, 10% dialogue. And it was so boring because there was so little interaction between the characters that it was all just telling me what was going on. The entire book, even though it was all description, was just telling me what was happening. And I was really surprised because this is a very popular author. She's on everybody's everybody's heard of this author, and this entire book was like this, and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't even really finish it, honestly. Not author bashing. I just felt like I was reading a history book as opposed to reading a fiction novel, because there's just so little interaction between the characters. So that's one of the things, like, you don't want to get too stuck in description. And I'm, again, a very description heavy author, but there's that balance that you need to achieve. And a great way to figure that out is to go to your beta readers, check in with them. Hey guys, here's some things I think I might be falling into, or here's something I think I could really use a tighter eye on. Can you please pay attention to, is there too much dialogue? Is there not enough dialogue? Am I getting lost in the weeds of descriptions? And I think that that's not a question I've really, prior to recently, that's not a question I thought to ask. And so I don't know that it was something necessarily that my beta readers would have thought to look for.
I think you said something really, really brilliant that I want to reiterate. And that is character interaction. Mm-hmm. And interaction does not necessarily mean dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And interaction, even if you, because I've read stories where it's actually been really dialogue light, because there are certain authors who are really good at like making you feel the character interaction without necessarily giving you every single line of dialogue.
Holly Black is a genius at that.
Yeah, but it's not.
I was going to say Poisonwood Bible is, I think, is like one of the most amazing like that.
Yeah, and so you can, but the key there is, even though you maybe don't get a lot of dialogue, you are getting a lot of character interaction. And they trick you into thinking that you get dialogue. Honestly, it is when I reread some of those, it's like, oh, there's not really much dialogue in here, but it doesn't skimp on those interactions.
Oh, I think that's really powerful, and to find excerpts where authors do that really well and kind of study it, I think is actually like something I adore doing in crafts, to like take it to the next level. And one of the things I want to throw out there is I have this thesis. Okay, so get ready to prove or disprove my thesis. So here's my thesis. My thesis is that in the balance between description and dialogue, the most important thing to keep in mind is pacing. So I'm going to make the argument that dialogue increases pacing and description can decrease pacing. Not always, but frequently. And that should be maybe part of when we're planning our novels, we should consider that. But I'm open to being totally wrong. So what do you think?
No, I 100% agree with that. It's writing is so freaking hard, and it's so wonderful, but it's so hard to put all these nuances in this, does the description match the emotion I'm trying to do? Does it match the character development? And then trying to figure out when to put it in there in a way that doesn't mess up the action is very, very difficult. And I think we've talked about sentence structure before. And a lot of times when you're doing these really intense scenes, you want it to be fast. You want like short sentences to the point, not a lot of flowery description, just enough to get the point across. But then you also, if you're not careful, you're not setting the scene correctly either. So you have to try to figure that out. And it also depends on where it is in the book. If it's later on in the book, you can skip a lot of the, like, they walked into the room and it had white creamy walls with a flower vase in the middle of the room. You can skip all that because you've already established it. That was not a good example of a description, by the way. That is not.
I mean, how big was the flower vase? How important to the story is it?
I don't know.
If it's like a Harry Potter thing where it's the freaking stamp on the sink that makes it the inanimate object insanely important. But that goes into picking and choosing. Back to the red apple example. The red apple in Teresa's book may just be a red apple, but the red apple in my book may be a poisoned apple, and it's the apple that we saw 10 chapters ago that the witch did something to. So, pick and choose what you're describing, but I do love that idea of the pacing and deciding how to make it go, because you can get lost in the weeds of description, but you can do a very succinct description, either remind people of, oh, this thing is there, or his hands were twitching on the desk, or something that kind of gives you clues that something else is going on, or alludes to a character's character, or who they are, how they may react to something that's happening in the dialogue.
Yeah, I think my take on this is dialogue can naturally drive your pacing, but it doesn't necessarily have to. So I think one of the reasons for that is when you talk about sentence structures, most of us talk in fairly short sentences, and there's a lot of back and forth. Outside of a podcast, someone doesn't usually talk to you for like 30 seconds straight or talk to you in a paragraph format. It's usually a sentence or two. Someone else responds. So you get this dynamic of push and pull and this adding of tension, which can really drive pacing and really like push something forward. But I can conceive of, I don't know why the door behind me closed. I can conceive of, using dialogue to slow something down potentially. You could probably do it if you tried.
Draw out a scene.
Yeah, if you really tried, you could probably do it.
That might be interesting to turn what's usually used one way and to turn it the other might be a fun stylistic choice.
Yeah, I think it's naturally easier just stylistically in dialogue to drive pace that way. It's an easy choice. But I don't think it has to be the only choice. Same with descriptions. You can, and something else here, like description and dialogue is not the only two things in a book. There is exposition potentially. There is narrator, either inner monologue of your character, or there is a narrator. I guess that would be exposition. There are other potential things in a book. It's just kind of easy to block things out that way. But I lost my train of thought. Someone help me.
Now you have me really thinking hard. So let's actually line it out. So you're describing what's going on in your world. You have dialogue back and forth. You have internal dialogue, which I would argue is just a form of dialogue, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then what are you saying exposition is?
I'm saying exposition can happen in dialogue, certainly. But exposition is basically when the reader is told how the world works or what the rules are. And sometimes it can be told via dialogue, or other times it can be told via, like, if there's a third person narrator. Great example here, Douglas Adams in Hitchhiker's Guide. Yeah. There's exposition where the narrator just tells you how the world works and just tells you about the Hitchhiker's Guide and about having a towel and stuff like that. And that's an example of exposition working very with a lot of voice, and it's interesting exposition. I think exposition gets a bad rap as being kind of boring in general. And it's also a very, like we talk about show, don't tell. Exposition is the tell. Exposition is when you just tell the reader something.
Yeah, but you do need it. You can't just sit there and in dialogue be like, so we're in this world and we've lived in this world our entire life, but let's go ahead and let's explain how magic works.
Yeah. And you can get constructs like Harry Potter, right? Harry Potter doesn't live in the world, has to go to the world, so people have to explain to Harry Potter how things work.
Which is brilliant.
Right? Yep. Brilliant. It's
the Alice in Wonderland trope, right?
Yep.
That's the Alice in Wonderland trope. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the stranger comes in, it's an outside. Yeah, it's a very common trope in fantasy. But it doesn't always work in fantasy because as Teresa said, sometimes these characters have been living there their entire lives. And you can slowly parse out like how the world works over scenes and how people interact and what the descriptions are, and you can do that. But sometimes it's just better to tell the reader.
Yeah. Sometimes you just got to do an info dump. And it's okay. You can do that. I think Molly's right. I think it's gotten a bad rap. What you don't want is you don't want your first 2 pages to be an info dump.
Or a flashback.
Yeah, no flashback. And also like, don't, I mean, and there's always exceptions to the rules. There's always ways to break it, and that there are authors who do a fantastic job breaking it. But in general, what you don't want is the main character being like, so let me tell you about the world in the first couple of paragraphs. That is not going to generally work. And I see that a lot in a lot of young and beginning writers. And by young, I mean beginning writers, not age-wise.
I think that's a symptom of the fact that starting a book is really difficult. And where do you start a book? And sometimes mentally you start with, okay, I have to explain to the reader what the world is like. I have to explain to the reader how the world works. And I think that is, like you said, new or more intermediate or younger writers, it's like, okay, where do I start? Well, I'll start here. And I think that's a fine place to start.
Agreed.
And then you have to go back and reassess. But sometimes it's good to just get something on the page and move from there. And that's fine. You do not stress it. Write your info dump at the beginning if you have to, and then come back and reassess.
Absolutely.
I watched a really good I saw a really good masterclass, and I cannot remember which author it was, because I've watched a lot of them, who described how he did hours and hours and hours, if not days worth of research on nuclear energy and how it affected whatever. And it was a lot of work, but he wanted to understand the topic because that was the issue that was facing the characters in the story. What he did, he had, so that he wasn't info dumping, he had an expert. One of the characters was an expert, and the other characters were not. And through the dialogue, this expert was able to explain to the people who weren't familiar what was happening. And I know that's kind of like what we're saying, not really to do, but he just explained it so well. If I find who that was, and if I can find an article on that, I will include it in our Discord. And because it was really interesting, and it was all about exactly what we're talking about, finding the balance between description and dialogue. And he knew that if he were to describe how this nuclear reactor, I think it was, worked, he would lose half of his readers in the description. So having it as a back and forth dialogue, it kept the conversation going, it kept the scene going, and he was able to get out all of the pertinent information without making it dull or boring or droning.
Yeah, I actually think that's a great system, is to bring in an expert, to explain to the non-experts what's going on. Yeah, great way.
When you're changing scenes, right? You're moving the character from one place to another. Do you find that it's really important to establish the setting first? Or do you think it's okay for, the dialogue to carry it and you to show them the world as they progress? Like, what are your thoughts about that?
I let the scene dictate it. I let the pacing dictate it. I let what's happening dictate it. If a character, something happens in one room or house or building or whatever, and then the characters are running away and then they go into another place, that is not generally the place to go into a big, huge description about what the room is, unless they have to, let's say they're running from zombies. I might kind of do a description of the room because they're going to have to reinforce it and protect themselves. But I wouldn't go into huge detail about it. It would be from a like, okay, door, couch, block the door. I'm not going to go into, and it was a blue couch upholstered in tweed. That's not the time. That's not unless it was okay, but I'm gonna take that back. Unless I want the character describing it to be having a mental breakdown, and then they focus in on that. They're like, that couch reminded me of my grandmother. As the zombies are like,
It's one of the moments I wish we were doing this on video, because that was a very great place.
Yeah. I think there's this. Well, I mean, we hear the advice, set the scene. You need to set the scene. And I don't know that I 100% agree with that advice all of the time, because in general, rooms are boring. Like, in general, a room is just there. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes there's something in the room that's important. Mm-hmm. And so I usually try to make sure that the description happens in a logical time, right? It's happening in a, if someone runs into a room, they might glance around the room to see, okay, I'm running from something. What can I use? And so the description of the room might be this person looking at the room to with the viewpoint of, what can I use as a weapon? Okay, that's a way to describe the room without cutting down on your pacing. If someone wakes up in a strange place, they might look around and try to figure out where they are. So to me, it's about, if I'm going to describe a place, I need to have a reason to do so. And I need to, it needs to somehow drive the plot. The things I'm going to talk about are going to be important. I don't like just talking about something for no reason. And that it could be important because it shows the character's mindset, right? Like Teresa said, they're having a mental breakdown. It could be important because it shows tension in the scene, right? They're looking around for a weapon. It could be important because, you go somewhere and it's your friend's house and you're looking around your friend's house and you're like, oh, my friend is rich. Look at all their rich shit. They have rich stuff. Why didn't my friend tell me they were rich? Right? Like it's driving the plot. It's driving characters. There's a lot of things that you can do. I personally don't care for and don't do just walking into a room and just looking at the room. Mm-hmm. To me, there has to be a purpose. And the stuff that you talk about has to be like, I'm talking about it for a reason. And sometimes the reason is blocking as well. But you can do that through dialogue. You don't have to have a big descriptor block that says, oh, there's a couch and there's a chair and there's a table. You can say, so-and-so said, sitting on the couch. Mm-hmm. He responded, getting up from his chair. Right? Like you can...
Which is great because it was a rocking chair. You can do things like that just to kind of weave them in.
Describing, but not having a big description block. Yeah. And I like that kind of stuff. But yeah, if I'm going to have a big description block, to me, there has to be a purpose beyond, let me as an author tell you about the room. To me, there has to be a purpose.
So one thing that I think is interesting that you guys have all pointed out is that in setting and in what you describe objects in the room, right? So setting both macro and micro setting. The critical component is how it links to the plot and the subplot. And if it's not advancing it, it doesn't belong. Even in scene transitions. So even in setting transitions, the entire transition needs to be set up, if nothing else, to promote mood then. Right? So that every time you're deliberately doing description, it sounds like it's very deliberate and well thought out. Sarah.
I loved what you said there, advancing the plot. I think that is so, I think if there's a takeaway from this, that's kind of the wraparound words for it. If the dialogue's not advancing the plot, if the description's not advancing the plot, does it need to be there? Molly just did the beautiful cut it out kind of look on her face there. And that it's so true. And that's something that I'm very much struggling with Blue Dragon Society, because I wrote it so damn long ago that a lot of it is old. I was in this description zone. And so trying to work on that while also balancing that the fantasy world. So there's a lot of world building involved. That's been an interesting challenge. So I'm constantly reminding myself, does this description, like Morgan says, advance the plot? And that is so true. And it's also really interesting because when you're writing, it goes to what genre you're writing, what audience you're going to. There's some places you really don't have to describe. Like Molly said, if it's a room, you kind of assume what's in it. If it's a bedroom, you kind of assume it takes place in an attic. We all pretty much know what an attic looks like. There's some things that you really don't have to do. And just if you're starting to wonder, should I or shouldn't I, stop and think of that phrase. Does it advance the plot?
Here's another one, Sarah, that I wanted to ask you specifically before we move on, because you and I both are on the detailed side and they're more on the dialogue side. Do you find that that genre includes this demarcation between literary fiction and commercial fiction, where you have more description in literary? You mentioned that you're influenced by Dickens, that you're influenced by Jane Austen, I think is the other one that you said, and I am too. We're both more of the literary canon type. Do you find that kind of bends us towards description, and also that literary fiction reads are more welcoming of description as a means for symbolism, for example, like you were talking about the red apple, going back to
I would say so. What's the symbolism behind the apple? Is it referencing to the Adam and Eve apple? Is it deeper than what it is? And if it goes beyond just like, there's a spoon on the table, what does the spoon represent? Is the spoon advancing the plot, and does it have deeper meaning to it that contributes to the plot? And I think that's sort of those elements of literary fiction of a spoon is not just a spoon. It has to represent something bigger. Of course, that's what's absolutely on my desk right now, so it's the closest thing. But I do think that literary fiction is more, like you said, welcoming to that. Those deeper descriptions. Deeper, not necessarily longer descriptions. I think that's an important distinction.
As someone who loves the dialogue and is more on the dialogue end, something that I had an epiphany about a little while ago was often in dialogue we try to recreate real sounding dialogue, which can be great. But we forget that real dialogue can be boring and not necessarily that useful. So like when you see someone, you're like, hi, how are you? How's the weather? Like small talk. You don't need that in your book. Like you can say like, they chatted about the weather, then there was an awkward silence, and then you can have your dialogue about like you don't have to give every single line of dialogue.
Yeah.
And especially not the boring dialogue. Not the dialogue that doesn't drive the plot. Doesn't drive the story. And my big moment happened where I was writing a scene and I was writing this dialogue, and the dialogue that I needed to happen had happened. Like the part of the story that I needed to tell had happened. And I was sitting there and I was like, okay, how do I make these characters wrap up the situation? How do I make them wrap up the dialogue? Because the night's not over for them, but they're like, they might hang out, but I don't really care what they do. Like, how do I wrap up this dialogue section? And, how do I do this? And then I was like, wait a second. And I spent way too long trying to figure out how to wrap up this scene and try to like do that. And then eventually my brain was like, just end the scene, Molly. Just end the scene. The scene's over. Just end the scene. Put a line at the end, put your little hook, and just end the scene. You don't need to keep going. It's done. Move on. And that to me was like, you don't have to wait for the characters to stop talking to end the scene. If they've said their important stuff, and sure, maybe they might continue to talk about the weather or the football game or kung fu movies, who knows? You don't have to keep following them. You can let them do their thing. Mm-hmm. And you as a writer continue to follow the story.
Yeah, and that's another thing. I do see that happen. I feel like most writers catch on to that one as they go through the draft phases. But early on, as you're just kind of like trying to figure these characters out, there is an element sometimes of small talk, and sometimes small talk can symbolize things that are going to happen, and sometimes too, like let's say you're writing a horror mystery and like the big climax is going to happen during a thunderstorm. It helps if you can kind of establish that the weather is starting to turn, and everyone comments on the weather, so you can do that in a small talk kind of way. But showing characters either that are awkward with each other or don't know each other very well can be a really good way to kind of do that, setting that scene in a really subtle way. I always love dialogue and description that serves multiple purposes. And really, if you're pushing the plot forward, that's what you should be trying to do. Trying to have everything serve multiple purposes.
All right, so here's a question for you guys. What kind of purposes can you serve? Like we've talked about, okay, it needs to be in there for a purpose. We've clearly said, okay, does it plot? Plot is a purpose. But there are other purposes too. So I kind of want to get your guys's, kind of go around the room and make sure we kind of wrap up some of these purposes that you can have in here.
So I would go first with character motives. Because it's going to be really unsatisfying if you can't connect with the character if you don't start to understand their motives. Even villain motives, right, are really, really important. Maybe even more important sometimes than protagonist motives. So character motives.
I'm going to launch off not just their motives, but characterization can be a purpose.
World building.
World building. Mood.
Tone, which follows right after mood, yeah.
What did you say, sorry?
Tone and mood, I think, right together.
Well, I think moral then, obviously, is our next one, right? So setting up what the moral is.
Theme, setting up what the theme is, jumping off of that.
I want to riff off of one that I don't fully understand. How would world building be a purpose unto itself?
If you need the information to understand what's happening.
So it's like a subcategory of plot. So what we mean by that is we need to know there's
information.
A secret door there or something, or we need to know that the vase you guys had in the room was enchanted. Then that type of world building is necessary because it's going to be used as plot vehicles.
Or you need to know how the magic system works, or you need to know how like the class system works in order to understand.
Oh, okay.
Because cultural influences, I think, or cultural description, I think, is a part of world building.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that. Okay, which also, so they all intertwine with each other. I mean, we don't, we're obviously wrapping up here, but what I'm hearing us say is that all of these things are intertwining to work together to advance the characters' motives, and their plot.
You're building a tapestry.
Yeah.
It's all, as I said earlier, I think in this episode, writing is hard. You have to, it's all of these little pieces all twisted together of theme and mood and description and dialogue, all layered on top of each other, combined with the overall plots, combined with the overall character arcs. And if you're doing your job, you have multiple character arcs for not only your main character, but your minor characters, your side characters should be arcing as well. Combined with the word choice you use, combined with the sentence structure and the paragraph structure and the chapter structure, all interlaced together to create this book that hopefully somebody reads and goes, that was cool. I want to read more.
Because it's balanced, which was our theme today. That's like the perfect aha moment. I love this tapestry of balance where the colors, I see this tapestry, the colors are all in harmony with each other and they flow. And I just love that. It's a great metaphor. Thank you, Therese.
I almost saw it when you were talking. And if you're too heavy on one or the other, or maybe you're blocking. We talked about the blocking and not interspersing stuff. You look at your tapestry and maybe there's like chunks of yellow, chunks of blue, chunks of yellow, chunks of blue, and really want
green.
If you're going for an overall color of green, you need to interweave them a bit more. But there's more than one way to do that. Like everyone's tapestry is going to look different, is going to be woven differently. Yeah, I'm loving this metaphor, Teresa.
Cute. Some people's tapestry are going to have beads on it or glitter.
Or have glitter.
You can have glitter. That glitter will get everywhere.
Glitter and gold dust.
Yeah. So we want to learn more about your tapestry. Thank you for joining us on this episode where we explored the balance between dialogue and description. Check us out on our website at semisages.com.
And there's always the Facebook, Semi-Sages the Pages.
Or shoot us an email at semisages@gmail.com.
And like we said, we're on all sorts of social media, including Discord if you want to hang out with us there. And like Morgan said, everything can be linked from our website. If you liked this podcast, go ahead and give us a 5-star review. It helps people find us and, listen to our crazy ramblings too.
Hope to hear you on Discord where we explore our tapestries together. Have a great day. Bye.
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 Thank you for listening to this episode of Semi-Sages of the Pages. Music used in the introduction was the song 5 Armies by Kevin MacLeod, which you can find at incomptech.com. It is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0, which can be found at creativecommons.org/licenses/by/3.0. Whew. That's a wrap.
As we wave again. All the way back.
I waved. I'm like, bye.
It gives my energy good. That's what I like.
That's why we're going to have to do, try one of these as recorded just so we can wait.